Well, welcome again, everybody. I hope you had a good rest, etc. Now, we have a real treat today. We're going to hear a talk by Sheila Fitzpatrick. And again, this is a person who needs no introduction, so I'll give her one. Because Sheila and I have known each other, I don't know, for decades and decades. We don't want to go into that. But for 10 years, we worked at the University of Chicago in a wonderful workshop with our late colleague, Richard Helly. And in many ways, under Sheila's leadership, we helped populate, along with Uri in Berkeley and a few other places, the Soviet historical profession for quite a while. And Sheila is the one who most courageously crossed what turned out to be a relatively artificial red line between imperial history and what went on after 1917. So when I was in graduate school at Columbia in the 1960s, Mark Ryoff, and more famously, Michael Karpovich at Harvard, would say there is no history after the revolution. I'm not exaggerating. But there was basically no serious study, with maybe a few exceptions, mostly in Britain, E.H. Carr, Isaac Deutscher, and others. I think one other figure I wanted to mention, and I just forgot, Alec Nove, who we talked about, and Moshe Levine, who then came to America. So Sheila very maybe courageously or rashly crossed that line, went to Russia, and wrote an incredible book about the Ministry of Education, Lunacharsky, and developed a notion of, eventually in the second book, of upward mobility. That, in fact, the Russian Revolution was about upward mobility of people, and that caused a huge controversy, as if, oh my God, she was saying something positive about the Soviet Union. So she was accused of every sin, from Stalinism to Marxism, to apologetics, etc. And yet she kept going on and wrote the most incredible bevy of books that established in many ways the field of Soviet studies. And today you have the pleasure of hearing Sheila Fitzpatrick.
Thank you so much. What I'm talking about today is, it's actually not my most recent book, but the one before came out in November of last year, called Lost Souls, Soviet Displaced Persons and the Birth of the Cold War. And there's really two big themes in this book, one of which connects much more obviously to my to my past as a social historian. One of the themes is the big geopolitical one. You've got 500,000 displaced persons from the Soviet Union in Germany after the Second World War. They don't want to go back. What to do with them? How to solve basically a refugee problem. And that's what having noticed that you're not particularly social historians here, I thought this is the angle I'll talk about today. The other angle is that's me as a social historian. That is the displaced persons themselves and the kinds of scope for resourcefulness within the structures that institutions and circumstances created, the kinds of initiatives they could show. It's a counter-argument to the one that you find in most displaced persons' memoirs, which was, I was a pawn of fate. I could do nothing. The waves of the 20th century swept over me, and there I was. And this is all true, I mean, but as the waves sweep, you're all the time trying to position yourself. You usually have a short-term goal, you're trying to develop long-term goals, and basically there is quite a lot you can do within those spaces, and that is from that I learned basically from an odd set of documents I had, which my husband Misha Danos, he had been a DP. And his mother was also a DP, and they were in different cities, thank God. in Germany, and therefore they wrote letters in that old-fashioned way. And the letters were preserved. And Misha was just interested in becoming a physicist, but his mother was extremely resourceful. She was constantly looking at the situation, thinking of the options, which one is the best to take, how would we best position ourselves, should we be in the camps or outside? If we're in the camps, how do we identify ourselves? Olga, his mother, was a master of all that, and that's what gave me that idea. However, I'm happy to answer questions on that, but that's not what I'm going to talk about. Let's get back to geopolitics. So the basic situation is that you have displaced persons are the people, well, it's self-explanatory in a way. It's the people who have been displaced during the war and are left in Germany after the war, and something needs to be done with them. Now, the Allies, who are the people who have to do this thing, you have the American and British occupation forces, plus the French, and you also have an international organization, UNRWA, which is specifically has the task of looking after this displaced person. The definition of a displaced person is someone displaced by war and fascism. That's the official definition that UNRWA accepts. Now, it's important for them to have an official definition because they're offering care and maintenance to people, and it can't be an inexhaustible number. Now, of that about 1 million, and the initial thought of about these displaced persons who are former forced laborers brought to Germany during the war, they're people, they're prisoners of war, who ended up in German prison camps, and then there are other people who at the end of the war crossed the border going west. So it's a mixed lot. The Soviet view is that the 500,000 or so that are Soviet citizens were taken as forced labor from the Soviet Union during the occupation, or Soviet prisoners of war. Their assumption, the Soviet assumption, is that they all should go home. They should be just repatriated. That is the solution to that problem. And that is UNRWA's attitude too, initially. They just simply assume that those people displaced by the war will be repatriated, and that's going to be one of the first post-war occupations. Then UNRWA and the Allies become aware of a problem. In other words, there are a substantial group, not anything like a majority, but it's a substantial group, maybe about a fifth to a tenth, somewhere in that, of displaced persons who do not wish to be repatriated. And they oppose it energetically. The Allies are more or less shamed into withdrawing their cooperation with the Soviets for the forced repatriation of displaced persons. So the group you have of displaced persons is one that emerges under UNRWA care. That is, by definition, people who had chosen not to go back to the Soviet Union. Now, back here, the whole notion of repatriation is complicated because the Soviets claimed everybody who had, as of 1940, had been a Soviet citizen. That includes all the West Ukrainians, West Belarusians, and people from the Baltic who had been in territories incorporated into the Soviet Union. From their point of view, the Soviet Union is not the homeland to which you repatriated. It's very likely an occupying power. And so, although we don't have absolute statistics on who comes from where, and basically because DPs they are who they say they are. In other words, UNRWA is not allowed to require any supporting documentation. Most of them don't have documentation. So that our knowledge of who these DPs are is based on what is written on their DP cards, which is based on what they told, what they said. And it's, of course, that's one of the first places where DPs could exercise agency. In other words, if you were a Soviet citizen and you thought you didn't want to repatriate, You might well have said you were a Pole, that you and given yourself a false birth placement in Poland, and that would be what would be on your DP identification things. Anyway, so it's a group which is formed both by the various acts of displacement that occurred during the war, and by the choice not to, the desire to avoid repatriation and the choice not to go back. So already you can see the possibility of two kinds of definition of who the displaced person is. One definition is the official one, written into UNRWA's constitution, that they're a victim of war and fascism. The other one is that they come from communist countries and don't want to go home. That tends to be the self-identification of the DPs themselves. But let's get back to thinking about this as a problem to solve. In diplomatic terms, it's one of the thorny issues that divide the Allies in the period of the breaking down of the wartime alliance that comes immediately after the war. It's not the main one. The Soviet Union absolutely set on the fact that it should get all its citizens back. Its citizens are its. It owns them. They simply need to be returned, and there's no possibility of discussion of any other option. The notion of individual choice on the part of the DPs is quite alien to the Soviet authorities. It's not, of course, alien to UNRWA. And UNRWA is in the difficult position that its mandate is to repatriate, but it neither has the will nor the ability to use force to do that. And so if people won't repatriate, it's going to offer them care and maintenance. But then what? So you have a sort of an impasse in which, this is in 46, beginning 47, when UNRWA's mandate is repatriation. The DPs don't want to repatriate. UNRWA isn't going to force them, and there's no plan B. In other words, is this going to be eternal care and maintenance in camps in Germany? They were actually quite comfortably housed after the first a few months. It was the situation of the DPs is another topic, but it's really not a bad one. And oddly enough, when you look at the further history, as I have, of DPs who were subsequently, and not under UNRWA, resettled in countries like Australia, the DP camps were much better than the Australian migrant camps that they ended up in for a year or so afterwards. So that gives a sort of funny twist to people's memory. So now I need to say something about the funding, the money aspect, because that's the key. UNRWA is an organization set up in 1943, rather presciently really, set up to deal with things, with the problems that will occur at the end of the war. And all the allies are involved in it. That includes the Soviet Union. It's one of the founding bodies of UNRWA. But the money is supposed to come from the allies, according to, I forget exactly to what kind of calculation. But in effect, the US pays almost everything. Soviet Union pays practically nothing. Britain pays something. But the big funder is the United States, and that funding has to go through Congress. And but in 1946, Congress starts to get really unhappy about why are we sending all this money to UNRWA, which in any case was perceived, another different story, as a sort of too pro-Soviet left-leaning organization. We're sending it to these people. So it's sort of run by Americans, but there are a lot of French and Brits and dubious types, not directly under American control. In other words, Congress is very unhappy at continuing that funding, and it cuts it off. It then funds a successor body, which is almost entirely American funded. This is the International Refugee Organization, IRO, Soviet Union does not become a founding member. At this point, the Soviet Union sort of separates itself from the whole issue. There's American leadership, and there's almost entirely American money, and there is a new mission, a new mandate, not repatriation, although it will repatriate if people, it's not against voluntary repatriation, but the mission is resettlement. Resettlement, and that in effect means outside of Europe. A very curious, ambitious, and expensive program. From the Soviet point of view, this amounts to theft of our citizens. And there was they had a whole line of outrage commentary on this, which basically said the capitalist countries, short of labor, are stealing our citizens for that purpose. And that was not true of the United States, which becomes the major recipient. It's not totally untrue, I have to say, of Australia, which is the second largest recipient. Australia did want labor. And it didn't actually want labor from Eastern Europe. It wanted British labor first, but there weren't enough potential migrants. Then German, but you couldn't take German. So can we try Scandinavian? But the Scandinavians don't want to move. So the Australians were forced to take what they regarded as a very unappealing lot of people. And the reason they did it was because there was a labor shortage. So there's a different, Canada is a sort of mixed, Canada comes next. That's a sort of mixed situation. Canada did want labor, but not that desperately. In any case, the Soviet attitude was a straightforward one. You're stealing people. So having decided on resettlement, IRO has to organize it, and it basically hunts around to see what countries will come up and volunteer. United States, oddly enough, although the organizer of the whole thing, United States is slow to do it, doesn't get the DP Act through till quite late in 48. But from middle of 47, selection committees from other countries, from Australia, from Latin America, primarily from Canada, are there, and DPs are being processed. Now the DPs, you couldn't exactly choose where to go because you couldn't be sure you'd be selected by a selection committee. However, you could choose when not to go. If you didn't want to go to Argentina, you were not going to be sent to Argentina because you hadn't applied to Argentina. You had to put yourself on a list. Everyone puts themselves on the American list first, and then if they don't get it, they try other lists. But it's a process which has elements of choice, but it's not wholly one of individual choice. It involves the countries, the recipient countries, they have preferences as to what kind of people they take. Any discrimination on grounds of race or religion was forbidden by IRO, but they didn't forbid discrimination on grounds of nationality. Now that gets very, very close. If we look at the Australian list, which was not actually published, but in the archives you find it, most desirable are people from the Baltic, Latvian, Lithuanian, Estonian. These are the very top ranking. Then come various Slavic people arranged curiously because the Australians didn't know anything about them. Big question about some people called White Russians. Do they come from Minsk or are they something else perhaps? Anyway, but so there's a hierarchy there, and then Jews at the bottom. And there's a whole other story about how IRO circumvents the fact that Jews are at the bottom. Also discrimination on basis of, choice, selection, on basis of occupation. A country like Australia, practically everywhere, wanted manual labor. So you want manual labor, you want young people, you would preferably, if they're not married, that would be good. They should be healthy. Yes, they should be healthy and young and willing to do manual labor. Now that, unfortunately, for the recipient countries, that is based on self-statement. So I'll only very briefly mention the first Australian shipload that went out on the General Heinzelmann, SS General Heinzelmann, an American troop ship, first lot of resettled DPs from Latvia, blonde and blue-eyed, because the Australians needed to be persuaded that this is not riffraff of the type you don't want. Australia had a white Australia policy, you may remember. So blonde and blue-eyed, and they had all said that they were builders, laborers, they were agricultural laborers, they worked in factories, whatever. They got the manual occupations that Australia wants. Then that ship landed. I think it's in Perth that Australian immigration come on board, and they ask the people who they are. And in the course of the voyage, 6 weeks only, an extraordinary thing has happened. Instead of builders, laborers, and domestic servants, you have professors of theology, children of diplomats, opera singers, lawyers. It's a wonderfully, and strangely enough, Australian immigration said, my goodness, what good types we've got. That types was a term they really liked. Really good types here. Anyway, so that all belongs under the heading of DP self-invention. But I mentioned in Australia the issue of whiteness. Now, this is an issue in general, and it deserves a little bit of, nobody is so explicit about it as the Australians, but the US also in the DP Act stipulates that DPs are Europeans, and Europeans is basically coded for white, and this becomes evident. At first, I think people didn't perceive any problem. I mean, Soviet Union, that means Russians, that means Europeans, that means white. That was, I think, the original assumption. But then it's noted that, in fact, the Soviet Union has a rather more complex population. And there are Buryats, there are Bashkirs, there are God knows what, that may not come under that heading. And the big test case was the Kalmyk one. Now, the Kalmyks are a Buddhist group from basically Asian origins, and they were difficult because they want to be resettled as a group, not as individuals. But basically, US immigration says they're not European, so they can't come under the DP heading. And IRO takes up that case. And it's, if I'm not mistaken, it's an Oliver Stone, perhaps related to the filmmaker, who argues the case against IRS, the case that the Kalmyks are essentially European. And this, sometimes Kalmyks based this argument on the fact that they were intermarried with Russians over many generations. That was how they individually tend to put it. But this argument made in the court in the US, this is a slightly different argument, which is that the Kalmyks, by virtue, they particularly focused on Kalmyk epics, which were said to resemble those of the Vikings and other Nordic people. They're extremely Nordic. They're essentially the same thing culturally. And on top of that, they're Democrats. They're very keen Democrats, and all of that conveys that they must be European, right? And this argument is accepted by the US court, which I find extraordinary. And the Kalmyks their case was fought by various, actually Protestant organizations, basically. But it was a success. As for the Australians, they didn't do anything as complicated as arguing about essential democracy or whatever. They did an eye test. I mean, an eyeball test. In other words, they looked at, if Australian immigration turned somebody down, there was a passage that said, there was one little line at the bottom for reason. And basically, according to the testimony of immigration officials interviewed later, if they looked at somebody and they thought they looked Mongol, okay, that person won't be happy in Australia because he'll stand out, and we wouldn't want to subject him to that. But they wouldn't write down Mongoloid features, which is what they privately thought. They would write down not politically, not acceptable. So that was how they handled that. Now, as you can imagine, but I won't go into great detail on this, there were tremendous Soviet complaints about this whole process. Clashes at the UN. The UN is a sort of supervisory agency over IRO. It's not actually, IRO is not within it, but it nevertheless. The Soviet representatives, Brzezinski is one of those arguing the Soviet case at the UN. They are incredibly aggressive, they're terribly unpopular, starting with Molotov, of course, but the whole American diplomatic presence just gets up everybody's nose very, very strongly. They make no friends. They have no networks to operate with, as far as we can see. Even Eleanor Roosevelt, who wants to be sympathetic with the Soviet Union, she really does. She just can't stand Brzezinski on the DP issue. It turns her off the Soviet Union very considerably. Now, I'll just briefly mention a problem about the resettlement of DPs in that the UNRWA and IRO constitutions said that people who have been collaborators with the Germans, with the Nazis in the war, they cannot be DPs. They are not eligible for DP status. So in general, people with obvious marks of collaboration, which usually, though not always, means having served militarily in a unit under German command during the war, those people often, sometimes they come into the camps giving a false identity, and that's quite possible. Other times they stay out of the camps, out of caution, not to be subjected to that eligibility, that possibility of being thrown out. But IRO has a limited time mandate. It wants to be finished, the job, by early 50s. So it doesn't want a lot of DPs who are collaborators left with nowhere to put them. And so there's a fascinating correspondence, private correspondence within IRO about what to do. And what the recommendation is that we, quote, liberalize the definition of eligibility. In other words, take collaborators. But to some degree, that is done in groups. For example, the Latvian Legion is a key issue, should people who fought with that, some of whom are conscripts, some of whom are volunteers, with different motives. How are we to, but they definitely collaborate with the Germans, so are they to be treated as collaborators or not? The IRO decides not. But then, and then with a variety of other individual cases, it liberalizes them. And so they come in, they become DPs right at the end of the process. And so you have a fascinating, IRO statistics are extremely dubious. Not their fault, but they are. But one I found quite fascinating is the one that shows yearly departures, yearly resettlement of the DPs, starting 47, 48, 49. And they're settling, first of all, a couple of 100,000, and then bigger numbers. Finally, they resettle 1 million. But the numbers in the camps, numbers of registered DPs, are also rising for the first 3 years. In other words, all the people who had not risked taking DP status are coming in. So this is, and by 1952, they've got practically everybody, collaborators and all, resettled. There's a hardcore, of course. There's that hardcore of non-resettled, but settleable, the old, invalids, the mentally ill, and there are a lot of people with psychiatric problems. But TB is the biggest of the physical, TB and venereal disease, those people very hard to fit. And another category, intellectuals. So if you happen to be an oldish professor of philosophy, you were absolutely the bottom for choice, and you were likely to have to stay. You probably you got left in Germany, and the Germans took. It was a couple of 100,000 that were left, and the Germans sort of, not very willingly, because they didn't like DPs, but they found them a place. They extended some benefits for them. But I'll sort of conclude with focusing on actually what I think is the interesting issue here. This is a major refugee crisis problem, and we're familiar with that in 20th and 21st centuries, but we're not familiar with them being solved. They hardly ever get solved. They fester, the people hang around, and nobody can decide what to do with them, and years pass, and there are new generations. I should mention that at the time that the DPs were identified as the major, they were identified after the war as one of 2 refugee problems of particular concern to to UNRWA and IRO and the allies in Europe. One of them is the DPs, and the other is the Palestinians in the Middle East. Groups of about the same size, between 700,000 and 1 million people that need, and these are crises that need to be solved that involve complicated diplomacy. Now, one of those crises was solved by early -- and the other one, as we know, was never solved. And so I thought I'd already actually written the book, and I was thinking, you know, so what is all this about? I mean, it's a success story in refugee management, but how do we explain that success? And I was at a my answer basically is that they were able, the DPs having been initially defined as victims of war and fascism, the definition shifted, not in writing, but in practice. The definition shifted to the definition the DPs themselves preferred, which is they're victims of communism. That's their essential nature. Victims, but also victims of communism. Now, that in terms of US Congress and the funding, in the first years of the Cold War, that is a very appealing designation. They are, in a sense, poster children for the choice of freedom and democracy over totalitarianism and repression. And they are given extensive publicity for that. And I mean, in fact, they embrace this role. They have, the DPs themselves have, in a sense, suggested this role. They are anti-communist nationalism. And anti-communism is what unites all of them, except the Jewish lot. And anti-communist and then it breaks down into Ukrainian, Polish, whatever. But those are the key elements, so it's that rebranding, as I saw, which was the way I initially put it, rebranding from victims of war and fascism, which by 47, 48, who cares? You know, that's past history. That's not, and especially who cares about putting in a lot of American money into it. But victims of communism, that's a different thing. That's really worth it. And the US pays, I should say, the US pays essentially for resettlement everywhere, not just to the US, but to Australia, to Latin America, and so on. Now, The Economist, the magazine The Economist, picked this up, gave this book a whole page review, but I didn't. I completely failed to notice it, and so did my publishers for some time, because it wasn't in book reviews, it was in international. And its heading was something like changing the narrative. So that's their version of my argument here. In other words, in order to solve a DP problem, a refugee problem, you need to change the narrative in a way that makes your people acceptable. And in the given case, which unfortunately not everybody is able to emulate, first of all, you've got to be branded democratic or European, which is treated as a synonym. Secondly, you've got to be white. That is not quite so straightforwardly put. You've got to be, that has to be that has to be what you're presenting as. A white European, and then you can get resettled. Now, if only this were a recipe for solution of other crises, other refugee problems, that would be good, but it isn't always possible. So I'll leave it at that.